The billionaire's order cut through the restaurant like a blade. Recite a poem in Arabic. Now. Sophia, a 24-year-old literature graduate turned waitress, had 30 seconds to prove she understood culture. The room went silent. She closed her eyes and began to improvise 47 verses about resilience, dreams, and the dignity of honest work. By the time she finished, the billionaire was on his feet, and everything changed. For 8 months, Sophia had been invisible, a literature graduate from Damascus, serving gold leaf desserts in Dubai's most exclusive restaurant, her degree worthless on a resume no one read. She had fled a war, crossed borders, and learned that dignity sometimes means showing up to a job far beneath your training. That night, she was just a waitress, until a billionaire decided to test her. What he didn't know was that her grandmother had spent years filling her memory with the poetry of a lost generation. The question wasn't whether she could recite. The question was what she would reveal. Sophia was 8 years old the first time her grandmother made her memorize a poem. Not children's rhymes, but the classical verse of Al-Mutanabi, the 10th century poet whose words still resonate across the Arab world. In the old city of Damascus, in a courtyard strung with jasmine and laundry, her grandmother Sana would sit on a cracked wooden stool and recite from memory, her voice rising and falling like a tide. She called poetry the spine of the soul. She said that if you carried enough verses inside you, no one could ever make you small. Sophia did not understand then. She would understand far too soon. In 2011, war came to Syria. Sophia was 12. Her family's home in Ghouta survived the first years, but the world around it shrank. School became intermittent. The nights were lit by distant explosions rather than stars. Her grandmother, already frail, refused to leave. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She filled Sophia's memory with poems, hundreds of them. Love poems, exile poems, praise poems, lamentations. She taught her the meters and the rhymes, the pauses where breath should catch. By the time her grandmother passed in 2018, Sophia could recite for hours without repeating a line. She carried that library across borders. After finishing her degree in Arabic literature at Damascus University, one of the few women in her year to do so, she tried to find work. But Syria's economy had collapsed. A literature degree meant nothing when families could barely afford bread. So she left. First to Beirut, where she worked in a bakery. Then to Dubai, where a cousin knew a man who could arrange a visa. Dubai gleamed like a promise, but the promise had fine print. Sophia's work visa tied her to a staffing agency, and the staffing agency placed her where the money was, high-end restaurants. She became a waitress at a restaurant called The Pearl on the 63rd floor of the Burj Al Arab. The dining room was a cathedral of gold leaf and crystal, where a single spoon of caviar cost more than her monthly rent. She learned to balance trays, to fold napkins into swans, to smile at men who never bothered to learn her name. From her first week, she understood the rules: be efficient, be agreeable, be invisible. She was 24 years old with a degree in classical Arabic literature and a memory stocked with the finest poetry of 1,000 years, and she was judged by how quickly she refilled a glass of sparkling water. But invisibility was a skill she had mastered. She shared a cramped room in Deira with another Syrian woman, sent every spare dirham to her mother and younger brother in Damascus, and told herself that this was temporary. 8 months passed. The work was exhausting, but she never complained. That was her first mistake, because the restaurant had a regular guest who noticed everything and who enjoyed nothing more than testing the limits of the people who served him. His name was Abdul Rahman Al-Mansur, 61 years old. A construction magnate whose cranes littered the skyline of half the Gulf. He had built his fortune from nothing, started as a laborer in Abu Dhabi, and now dined at the Pearl 3 nights a week, always at the same table by the window. He was known for 2 things: tipping extravagantly and humiliating staff who failed his impromptu tests. He had once made a sommelier identify 11 grape varietals blindfolded. Another night, he had a waiter recite the menu backwards from memory. He called it respect for craft. Others called it cruelty. But behind the demands was a man running from something. His wife of 30 years had died of cancer in 2021. His only daughter had moved to London and stopped calling. The billions he had accumulated could not fill the silence in his penthouse, and so, perhaps, he filled it with noise. The the clink of crystal, the laughter of business partners, the small adrenaline of watching people scramble to please him. That night he was entertaining 3 investors from Qatar, and the conversation had turned to a topic he could not resist: the death of Arabic culture among the young. One of the investors, a man in a white dishdasher with a gold watch, laughed and said that no one under 40 could recite a classical poem anymore. They know tick-tock, not tarafa. Abdul Rahman did not laugh. He turned in his chair, scanning the room. And then he raised one hand, 2 fingers extended, the gesture that meant come here. Sophia saw the gesture from across the dining room. Her breath caught. She was carrying a tray of saffron-poached pears. Every server knew what that hand signal meant. It meant one of Abdul Rahman's tests. Her section manager, a nervous Portuguese man named Rui, whispered urgently, "Go before he complains." She set down the tray and walked toward the table, her heart clattering against her ribs. The restaurant had gone quieter, as if the entire room sensed what was coming. When she reached the table, Abdul Rahman looked up at her with cold, appraising eyes. "The gentleman here says young Arabs have lost their culture," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "I told him he is wrong, so now you will prove it." He picked up his water glass and swirled it, watching her recite a poem in Arabic. "Now, if you understand anything about culture, show us." Sophia felt blood rush to her face. Every patron was looking at her. The investors smirked. The clatter of the kitchen seemed to stop. She was supposed to be invisible, and here she was, pinned in the light. The rules said she should apologize, bow, and retreat, but something else rose in her, a voice from that courtyard in Damascus, her grandmother's voice. And before she could think about her job, her visa, her future, she opened her mouth. But instead of the safe, familiar verse of Al-Mutanabi, she began to speak words she had never spoken before. And that was when the real story began. The first words came out in a voice she barely recognized as her own. They were not Al-Mutanabi. They were not any poem her grandmother had made her memorize. They were new, rising from a place that had been silent for years. She began with the jasmine of old Damascus, with the sound of water in a stone courtyard, with the smell of bread baking before dawn. Her voice shook on the second syllable, but by the third verse it had steadied. By the fifth, the room had stopped moving. She kept her eyes closed. It was easier that way. She did not see the forks frozen halfway to mouths, the waiters pressed against the kitchen doors, the maitre d' staring as if a ghost had walked through the dining room. She saw only her grandmother sitting on that cracked stool, nodding slowly as each line landed. Her hands hung at her sides. Her body swayed almost imperceptibly, and the poem built itself. She spoke of exile. She spoke of the long road from Ghouta to Beirut to Dubai, of sleeping on floors and washing dishes until her fingers bled. She spoke of hunger, not just for food, but for recognition. She spoke of a woman who carried a library in her chest while carrying trays of other people's excess. She spoke of the dignity of honest work, the nobility of serving without losing your spine. The poem was not a complaint, it was a declaration. Each verse was a brick in a tower she had never known she was building. The Arabic was classical but not archaic. She bent the old meters with a precision that would have impressed a professor. Her grandmother's voice was in her throat, but the words were her own. The third line of the 10th verse made an elderly Emirati woman at a nearby table begin to weep silently. The 14th verse made one of Abdul Rahman's investors set down his fork and stare, no longer smirking. By the 20th verse, every phone in the room was recording. By the 30th, Sophia had stopped being a waitress. She had become something none of them had expected. She did not count the verses as she spoke. The number would be tallied later, first by a poet in the dining room, then by journalists, then by millions of people who watched the video online. But in the moment, there was no arithmetic. There was only the current of language pulling her forward. She wove in the names of rivers, the taste of Damascene plums, the memory of her mother's hands kneading dough. She wove in the sound of mortars, the silence after a bombing, the particular grief of leaving home while home still breathed behind you. The 47th verse ended not with a question, but with a resolution. She closed the poem as she had learned to close a prayer. And then she opened her eyes. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. 300 people sat absolutely still. The chandeliers above them seemed to hold their breath. Abdul Rahman's face, which had been stone, had cracked open. His eyes were wet, His lips were parted. The glass of water in his hand was trembling. Beside him, the young Qatari investor named Faisal Al-Kuwairi, a man who had spent his life collecting rare manuscripts, was gripping the edge of the table as if the floor had tilted. Then, from a corner of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was an old family doctor from Jeddah, a woman nobody knew was listening. Her applause was not loud. It was gentle, almost reverent, but it broke the spell. The room erupted. Dozens of patrons rose to their feet. The applause seemed to shake the golden walls. A waiter dropped a tray of glasses, and even that sounded like a celebration. Sophia stood there, blinking, as if waking from a fever. But before anyone could mob her, Faisal Al-Kuwairi stood up. His chair scraped the marble. The clapping faltered. He pointed a trembling finger at Sophia, not in anger but in disbelief. "That was not ordinary improvisation," he said, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. "You just recited a sequence based on Al-Muwashsha al-Ghaib, the lost Muwashsha of Al-Andalus. Only a handful of people alive have ever even seen a fragment of that meter." Sophia stared at him, confused. The words meant nothing to her. She had not planned the structure. She had not chosen the meter. She had simply followed the current. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I just spoke what came." Faisal turned to Abdul Rahman, his face pale. "You know what this means? That was the missing pattern, the one Layla spent her life trying to reconstruct." At the mention of that name, Abdul Rahman closed his eyes. For the first time since Sophia had met him, the billionaire looked fragile. He set down the water glass very carefully, as if it might shatter in his grip. Then he stood. The room fell silent again. "My wife," he said, his voice hoarse, "was a scholar of Andalusian poetry. Before she died, she believed there was a lost form, a kind of stanza structure that could hold the full range of human grief and hope. She called it the absent verse. She worked on it for 20 years. He paused, and his gaze found Sophia. "I have spent the last 2 years testing people, trying to find someone who could finish what she started. I thought I was looking for a scholar. Instead, I found a waitress." Sophia's stomach dropped. The words landed like stones. For 2 years, this man had been performing his cruel tests not for sport, not to humiliate, but to find a living spine for a dead woman's dream. The amuse-bouche identification, the backward menu recitation, the blindfolded wine tasting, they were all auditions. But Sophia was not an academic. She was a woman who had served him 8 times and never once been asked her name. The maitre d' appeared at her elbow now, urgently whispering, "You need to come with me. You've broken protocol. This is not how staff are expected to behave." But before she could move, Abdul Rahman raised one hand. "She stays." The maitre d' froze. The owner of the restaurant, a thin Frenchman named Monsieur Pascal, appeared from a back office, his face a mask of panic. He approached the table, bowing slightly. "Mr. Almansa, we deeply apologize for this disruption. If the young woman has caused offense, we will handle it immediately. We can have security escort her out." Sophia's heart hammered. Her visa flashed through her mind, her rent, the money she sent home. In one moment, she had risked everything for a poem. And now the machinery of the restaurant, built on hierarchy and discretion, was preparing to crush her. But Abdul Rahman did not even look at the owner. He was looking at Sophia. "Nobody is escorting her anywhere," he said. Then he pulled out the chair beside him, the one usually reserved for his most important guests. "Sit down," the room inhaled. Sophia did not move. She could see the restaurant staff watching in horror. A waitress did not sit at a guest's table. It was unthinkable. It was impossible. But the look in Abdul Rahman's eyes was not a request. It was a summons. And the man beside him, Faisal, was already reaching into his jacket as if for a pen or a card. "Sit," Abdul Rahman said again, softer this time. "Please, there is something I need to ask you, something only you can answer." And then he did something that changed the entire room. He reached into the inside pocket of his thobe and withdrew a small, worn leather notebook, the kind a woman might have carried everywhere, the kind filled with handwritten notes, crossed out lines, and desperate hopes. He held it out towards Sophia like an offering. "This was my wife's. She wrote the first half of a poem in the absent verse. She never finished it. I have carried it with me every day for 2 years, waiting for someone who could complete the final stanza." He opened the notebook and turned it toward her. The page was covered in elegant Arabic script, but the bottom half was blank. The silence that fell now was different. It was not awe, it was expectation. If you can finish what she started, Abdul Rahman said, his voice cracking, then I will believe that your poem was not an accident, and I will give you everything you need to become what you were always meant to be. Sophia looked down at the empty half of the page. Her mind raced. She had never seen the lost muwasha. She had never heard the term before tonight. But something inside her, something deeper than knowledge, stirred. It was the same feeling she had had as a child, sitting at her grandmother's feet, when the poems arrived not from memory but from somewhere older, somewhere shared. She reached for the notebook, but just as her fingers touched the leather, a sharp voice cut through the room. Don't touch that. It was the third investor, a man named Sheikh Nasser bin Mohammed, older, heavier, with a face like a closed door. He had not spoken during the entire recitation. Now he stood, his hand raised, his eyes cold. Abdul Rahman, he said slowly, you are not thinking clearly. This woman is a server. She could be an actress. She could have studied your wife's work. She could be a fraud. And you are about to hand her a piece of your heart in front of a room full of strangers. The accusation hit Sophia like a slap. She pulled her hand back. The room shifted, uncertain. Abdul Rahman stared at the notebook, then at Sophia, then at the old sheikh. The two men had been friends for 30 years. And now they stood on opposite sides of a line no one had drawn before. Sheikh Nasser shook his head. If you want to test her, do it like a businessman, not like a grieving widower. Make her prove the meter. Make her complete the poem now here with no preparation. If she fails, she is exactly what she appears to be. If she succeeds, he trailed off, and his eyes flickered to Sophia with something unreadable. Then perhaps your wife was right after all. The restaurant held its breath. Abdul Rahman looked at Sophia. His hand still held the notebook. The blank page seemed to glow under the chandelier light. She had already given 47 verses, but now the real test was beginning, and she did not know if the voice would come again. She did not know if the voice would come again, but when she looked at the open notebook, something shifted deep inside her. The half-poem was not strange to her. It was familiar in a way she could not name. Meter was the same one her grandmother had hummed in the dark of their old Damascus house, a tune without words that had followed Sophia through every long night of her childhood. She had called it the green tune because it felt like something growing. Now she understood it was not a lullaby at all. It was a fragment of the absent verse, passed down through generations of women who had no idea what they were preserving. She lifted her eyes to Abdul Rahman. My grandmother used to hum this meter. She said it came from her own grandmother, from women who kept songs after Al-Andalus fell. I never saw it written down, I only knew the feeling of it. Faisal stepped closer, his disbelief giving way to something like awe. That is impossible. The absent verse was never copied. It was thought to have died with the last poets of Cordoba. Not died, Sophia said quietly, hidden in the voices of women who were not allowed to write. The room had become a kind of pressure chamber. Most of the diners had forgotten their meals. Waiters stood motionless. Even the kitchen staff had crept to the doorway. Somewhere, a phone was still recording. The video of her first 47 verses was already moving, not yet burning through the internet, but smoldering in group chats, being forwarded from Dubai to Amman to Cairo. Within 20 minutes, it would reach 1 million people. Within an hour, newsrooms would start calling. But none of that had happened yet. In this moment, there was only the notebook and the blank half page. Read the first part aloud, Sheikh Nasser said, his voice flat. If you are not a fraud, let us hear how you handle Layla's words. Abdul Rahman hesitated. This was not for an audience. No, Sheikh Nasser agreed. It was for you, which is why this test matters. If she is what she claims, she will remember. If not, she will fail. Sophia looked at the heavy-set man and saw something she had seen many times in her 8 months serving the rich. He was not protecting his friend. He was protecting something else. There was a hunger in his eyes, not for proof, but for the notebook itself. She did not know what it meant yet, but she knew she could not let him win. May I stand? She asked. Abdul Rahman nodded. She rose from the chair, the cloth napkins sliding from her lap. She did not belong at that table, and everyone knew it. But she did not need to belong. She only needed to speak. She began to read the half-poem aloud. Layla's handwriting was elegant but uneven, as if the words had been written during moments of pain. The poem was about a woman standing at the edge of a river, watching boats leave for cities she would never see. It was about waiting. It was about the silence that follows a life of service. And it ended in the middle of a rhyme. as if the poet had set down her pen one final time and never picked it up again. When Sophia finished the last written line, she closed her eyes. The silent half of the page seemed to open beneath her feet. She thought of her grandmother's cracked hands, of her mother's voice on the phone, of the long bus ride out of Damascus when the city was still smoldering. She thought of the word exhale, how it felt heavy in the chest and light on the tongue. And then, without deciding, she began to complete the poem. The new verses came slowly. Each one arrived complete, as if it had been waiting for someone to listen. She kept Layla's river metaphor but turned it into a sea. She wrote with her voice because there was no pen. The woman at the river became a woman crossing the gulf, not as a passenger but as a worker. The boats became planes, the waiting became labor, and the silence became a kind of song. She recited 8 stanzas, 10, 12. Each new meter locked into place with the precision of a key turning. Faisal had pulled a small notebook from his own pocket and was scribbling, his face pale with concentration. Abdul Rahman had covered his mouth with one hand, tears running unchecked into his beard. Even Sheikh Nasser had gone still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Sophia as if seeing her for the first time. She did not stop until the final couplet. When she reached it, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Abdul Rahman. The last line was not about his wife. It was about both of them. It was about the cruelty of demanding proof of a soul that has already given everything. But it was also about the mercy of being seen. The silence that followed was different from the first. It was not astonishment. It was recognition. The old family doctor from Jeddah had begun to cry openly. Monsieur Pascal, the restaurant owner, had lowered himself onto a chair, his face ashen. Rui, the section manager, was shaking his head as if trying to wake from a dream. Then Sheikh Nasser stood. He did not clap. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen and held it up. On it was a recording of Sophia's first 47 verses, already playing on a social media platform. The view count was climbing by the second. "Congratulations," he said softly. "You are already famous, but fame has a way of revealing the truth." He turned to Abdul Rahman. "I warned you. This woman did not learn this meter from her grandmother. I have seen that lullaby before. It was collected by a French ethnographer in 1932 and published in a book Layla owned. Your wife showed it to me. Anyone with access to that book could have studied it." The accusation landed like a stone in still water. Sophia felt her throat tighten. She had never heard of the French ethnographer or the book, but she had no way to prove it. Her grandmother was dead. Her mother was in Damascus. The only evidence she had was her own voice. "That is a lie," she said quietly. "I have never seen any book." "Perhaps not," Sheikh Nasser said, "but the resemblance is remarkable, and the fact that you completed the poem so quickly only proves you have had practice. A fraud does not need to be a genius, she only needs to be well rehearsed." Faisal stepped between them. "Sheikh Nasser, that book contains only the melody, not the words." "I have studied it myself. The lyrics were never transcribed, you know this." Sheikh Nasser smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I know many things, Faisal. I also know that Layla's notebook has been missing for 2 years. Abdul Rahman tells everyone he carries it, but a grieving man can be deceived. Perhaps this woman is not after his gratitude. Perhaps she is after something else." He let the implication hang. Several guests at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. The phones were still recording. The internet was already filling with speculation. Someone at a back table had found Sophia's name through a server's social media and was posting it. Her face was becoming public property. Abdul Rahman turned to the sheikh, his voice low and dangerous. "You will stop speaking about her as if she is not standing here." "I am only trying to protect you," Sheikh Nasser replied. "But if you wish, we can settle this properly." There is a symposium at the Abu Dhabi Cultural Foundation next week. Scholars of classical Arabic poetry from 12 countries will attend. Let her perform the absent verse there, in front of people who have devoted their lives to this work. If she is genuine, she will be celebrated. If she is not, she will be exposed. The words sent a chill through the dining room. Sophia felt the trap closing. Public performance before hostile scholars, with no preparation, no support, and the entire Arabic-speaking world watching. It was madness. It would destroy her. But before she could answer, something else happened. One of the waiters, a young Iraqi man named Marwan, stepped out from the kitchen doorway. His face was pale and he was holding his phone as if it were a live grenade. "Miss Sophia," he called, his voice shaking. "Your mother is calling. She says there are men outside your apartment." The room froze. Sophia's blood went cold. Her first thought was not of the poetry or the billionaires or the symposium. It was of her mother, alone in Damascus, and the men who had come asking questions. The war had taught her what that meant. The world had found her, and it was already reaching into the places she loved. "Give me the phone," she said, but Marwan's next words changed everything. "It is not your mother," he said, staring at the screen. "It is Sheikh Nasser's son. He is standing outside your building with two men, and he is telling everyone you are a fraud." The room turned to Sheikh Nasser, who had gone very still. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. The smugness drained from his face, replaced by something far more complicated. He looked up at Sophia, and for the first time there was something like fear in his eyes. "Tell your people to stand down," Abdul Rahman said, his voice like stone. "Or I will show every guest in this room what you and your son have been doing for the last year." The air left the room, and Sheikh Nasser, the man who had accused Sophia of deceit, slowly lowered his phone and said two words that turned everything upside down. "She knows. She knows." The words fell out of Sheikh Nasser like a stone from a broken wall. Nobody in the dining room moved. Abdul Rahman kept his eyes on him and said, "Yes, she knows, and now so will everyone else." He stepped between Sheikh Nasser and the exit. Then he turned to the room. "For 2 years, this man and his son have been selling forged manuscripts of the absent verse. They targeted collectors who wanted what did not exist. They aged paper with chemicals. They copied calligraphy from photographs of manuscripts that had never been catalogued. My wife Layla found the evidence 6 months before she died. She hid it in the end papers of this notebook." Sheikh Nasser tried to interrupt, but Abdul's voice rose above him. "The tests you all watch me perform, the wine tastings, the blindfolded sommelier, the backward menus, they were never about my ego. They were a cover. I needed Sheikh Nasser to think I was still a broken man with no idea what he was doing. I carried this notebook every night and let him see me give people impossible tasks. He thought I was searching for a fraud. I was actually waiting for him to try to take the evidence." Sophia looked down at the notebook in her hands. The inside back cover was thick, as if something had been pasted into the leather. She ran a fingernail along the edge. Several layers of paper shifted. There were rows of tiny Arabic script, names, dates, the names of collectors, the ledger of forgeries. Abdul continued. "Tonight, when that video started spreading, Sheikh Nasser panicked. He sent his son to Sophia's apartment to call her a fraud. He didn't know my security team had been watching him for months. His son was taken into custody 10 minutes ago. He has already admitted everything." Sheikh Nasser's face had gone grey. "You cannot do this," he whispered. "We made you. Without my family, your first tower would never have been built." Abdul nodded slowly. "That is true, which is why I gave you 2 years to stop. But you didn't stop. You escalated. And tonight, you made the biggest mistake of your life. You tried to destroy the one person who could finish what Layla started." He turned to the 2 Qatari investors. "Faisal and his companion were already on their feet. I ask you to witness that he is not leaving this room. The police are on their way." Sheikh Nasser made a move for the door, but Faisal stepped into his path. "Sit down, Nasser. It is over." The sheikh stared at him, then at the phones recording from every corner. His shoulders sagged. He sat. Only then did Abdul turn to Sophia. The change in his face was total. Gone was the cold, demanding billionaire. In its place was a man whose grief had finally found a shape. "I am sorry," he said. "I made you prove yourself before strangers. I did not know who you were until the moment you opened your mouth. But now I do." He took the notebook from her carefully and opened it to the first page. Beneath the opening line of Layla's half-poem was a list. 4 handwritten names, stretching back more than a century. The last entry was partly rubbed away, but Sophia could see it clearly. "Sana of Damascus." And beside it, in fresher ink, a single word, "granddaughter." "My wife traced the absent verse through oral histories across the Arab world," Abdul said. "She found the tradition alive in the songs of women who had no scholars to write them down. For 3 years, she corresponded with a woman in Damascus named Sana, a woman who had learned the tune from her grandmother and taught it to her granddaughter. She never told Layla the granddaughter's name. She only said, 'The green tune grows in her.' She said, 'One day she will finish what we started.'" Sophia's legs nearly gave way, her grandmother's nightly humming. The tin box she was never allowed to open, the look on Sana's face whenever the lost words came. It had all been preparation, not for a test. For this, I never knew, Sophia whispered. Neither did I, Abdul said, not until tonight. When you recited the first 47 verses, you did something the scholars said was impossible. You reconstructed the absent verse from memory, but not from a book, from the voice of a woman who loved you. He reached into the back of the notebook and drew out a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges. This was hidden behind the ledger. I never opened it because I did not know it was there. The police found it just before I came to dinner. It is addressed to the granddaughter of Sana. It is from Layla. Sophia took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it slowly, aware that the room had grown so quiet she could hear the paper tear. Inside was a single sheet, written in the same elegant hand as the half poem. She read it silently, her eyes filled with tears. The letter said, "If you are reading this, then the war did not take you." It said, "Your grandmother told me you carried more verses than she could count." It said, "Finish the poem not for a stage, not for a prize, but for the women who hid the verse in their chests when the libraries burned." It said, "I will be listening, even from where I am." Sophia folded the letter and pressed it to her heart. She looked at Abdul. He was watching her as if she were a door opening in a wall that had been shut for 500 years. 1 month later, the Abu Dhabi Cultural Foundation Symposium was packed. Scholars from 12 countries, journalists, poets, and the curious. Sheikh Nasser was in custody. His son had confessed to 42 forgeries. The video of Sophia's first 47 verses had passed 200 million views. Faisal al-Kuwairi had vouched for her authenticity in an open letter signed by 107 academics. And Abdul Rahman had kept his promises. A fully funded graduate scholarship for Sophia in Arabic literature. A research grant to document the oral poetry of Syrian refugee women. A permanent position at the Amira Layla Foundation, named for his wife, dedicated to preserving endangered Arabic verse. But the moment that mattered came at the end of the symposium. Sophia walked to the microphone. She did not introduce herself. She simply looked out at the crowd and began to recite the completed poem. Layla's half, her own half, the women's half. By the 4th verse, the auditorium was silent. By the 12th, some scholars had begun to copy down the meters by hand. By the final couplet, there was not a dry eye in the hall. When she finished, she said one sentence. "My name is Sophia, daughter of Samira, granddaughter of Sana. I was a waitress. Now I am a bridge." Then she walked off the stage and into a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. The billionaire who had ordered her to recite a poem had not given her the poem. Her grandmother had. But he had given her the chance to be seen. And that, it turned out, was worth more than any amount of money. But the story does not end there, because stories like Sophia's never really end. They keep moving through other women, other waitresses, other hidden libraries carried in the chests of people the world has trained itself not to see. The absent verse was never truly lost. It was simply unrecognized. For 500 years, scholars searched for it in archives and manuscripts, in the ruins of Cordoba and the shelves of private collections. But it was not in any of those places. It was in the kitchens, the courtyards, the crowded buses, the service corridors. It was being sung, not written, remembered, not catalogued, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from exile to exile, from one woman who was told she did not matter to another who refused to believe it. Sophia did not become extraordinary because a billionaire discovered her. She was extraordinary before Abdul Rahman ever lifted his hand. She was extraordinary while carrying trays of saffron-poached pears, while smiling at guests who never asked her name, while sending money home and crying in the stairwell on her break. The poetry was always there. The test did not create it. It only revealed it. And that is the part of this story that should keep you awake. Because how many Sophias are still invisible? How much brilliance is standing behind the counters of petrol stations, folding hotel towels, picking fruit, delivering packages, speaking 3 languages but being asked only for the price of a coffee? The world is full of absent verses. They are everywhere waiting for someone to say, "Show me what you know. Show me what you carry." The tragedy is not that these stories are rare. It is that they are so common and so rarely witnessed. Abdul Rahman learned this too late for his wife, but not too late for himself. And that is perhaps the only difference between a tragedy and a testimony. The moment someone is seen, the story changes. It does not undo the past. It does not erase the 8 months of invisibility or the years of war, but it bends the future. It opens a door, and one open door can let in enough light for 1,000 others to follow. The question this story leaves behind is not about poetry. It is about perception. What are you missing in the people you pass every day? What verse is being carried in silence right beside you? You do not need a billionaire's table to answer that question. You only need the willingness to ask. If this story stayed with you, then let it change one thing today. Look at the person serving your food, cleaning your street, driving your car, and wonder what they know. Not pity them, wonder about them. Because somewhere between the first verse and the 47th, Sophia stopped being a waitress and became a reminder. And the reminder is this: no person is ever just one thing. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember the dignity of honest work. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories that will make you see the world differently. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? What hidden gift are you carrying? We read every single one. Until next time, keep looking for the absent verses. They are closer than you think.